there, and thank you for scrolling through your device to this episode of Bandwidth Coast to Coast. I had the pleasure of speaking with a great writer, environmental steward, and an important voice in the moment we're all living through. For many of us, 2020 has marked a year where the zeitgeist of climate change drastically shifted from warnings of gloom to seeing stark examples of its effects. It may be hard to spot immediately in our lives, but between more than 26 hurricanes appearing in a season, requiring the names to start using the Greek alphabet, not to mention fires in Australia, then California, the climate has been a major character of 2020, the epic tragedy. I became aware of my guest from, of all places, but fitting for the time, on a Twitter thread where he explained how improper management in California forests, not just climate change, is increasing the likelihood of fires and their magnitude. In a time where singular reasoning prevails, Nathanael Johnson, a senior writer for grist.org, jumped into the Thunderdome and offered insight. He explained how the increased threat from climate change is highlighting the drastic need for better management of forests. It's a bold thing to step right into the debate with a perspective that explains that the two opposing narratives aren't opposing, but both true. I read some of Nathaniel's work on Grist, checked into his books, and before I knew it, we had a time scheduled to talk. A native Californian with an incredible tie to the land himself, Nathaniel shares where his love of nature comes from, how he got active in environmental causes, and along the way gave me an incredible amount of faith in being able to shift course for the future. At the end of our conversation, I mentioned a book by author J.M. Coates, Waiting on the Barbarians. In the book, other than being a captivating, thought-provoking read, it centers around the ways in which politics can distort and create a quote-unquote enemy. In the case of the book, the threat isn't all that it seems, but the framework from which it works serves as a lesson in all matter of things. For the purposes of listening to the next 60 minutes of audio, I wish to posit this thought to you. Decades have passed, with warnings about the catastrophes awaiting us if we continue to march on, affecting our atmosphere, landscape, and oceans the way we are. Each spiral around the sun has only sped up the pace, though. When an invisible enemy that involves every part of everything around you, and is in turn affecting an invisible set of systems that we really don't have a tangible understanding of how they interact or work with each other, which is then killing off whole lines of evolution and causing a hurricane to hit Des Moines, Iowa, what is there to do but wait? How can we turn that whole convoluted sentence of wrapping up everything into some form of action? Well, there's no more waiting on invisible barbarians to come marching over a hill. They're at the gates, and we're not ready. In fact, we've been sleeping on watch. But we can plan and jump into the ring. In episode 4, we heard from Ron Good, and in that conversation, he mentions how California forest canopy exploded since 1840. In this episode, Nathaniel makes the past 30 years of forest management come into full color. Nathaniel goes into the current state of forest management in California, how it got to be this way, and what is being done to improve it. If you're looking to understand options so that an orange sky in San Francisco doesn't become a regular occurrence, there's not much better of a place to start with than Nathanael Johnson. Real quick before the episode starts, if you'd like to find us on your social media platform of choice, sign up for our mailing list to be the first to know about episode drops, know about upcoming guests or opportunities to ask questions and provide suggestions, please visit us at bandwidthpodcast.com. And of course, if you like what you hear, please follow, comment, or subscribe to the pod, however it is that this is getting to your ears. Thank you for listening. Hit the drums. All right, so just so we have it before I forget, would you just introduce yourself however you would like to, like who you are and all
Yeah,
that?
my name is Nathanael Johnson. I am a senior writer for Grist, which is an environmental news magazine online, grist.org, and I've written a couple of books and been interested in and writing about the environment since 2001.
Yeah. What got you into environment kind of macroly? Is I know that we were kind of going back and forth that you were always you were raised in a very environmental active kind of family.
Right. Yeah, really from from day one. I mean, I think the thing that triggered it for me was just spending time in beautiful places. My family would go to Yosemite. We would go on backpacking trips for 10 days or a week every year. From the time I was a tiny baby, they'd just stick me up on the top of the backpack and let me go play in freezing creeks until I turned blue. And and I just, so I would be in these beautiful places, and when you're a kid, you have that sense of tradition every year. It becomes this sort of magical thing. And then we'd be coming down from the high mountains, and it would just get less and less beautiful. You get back into civilization, there's more people, there's more horse poop, and then you get to the parking lot, and that's kind of grody, and there's RVs, and then you descend down and you start to get into seeing gas stations, and then the sprawl in the Central Valley, and then you're back into strip mall land. And I was just like, why can't everything be like it is up in the backcountry? And so I think that really sparked this exploration, is just the aesthetics.
So I live in California now, and I'm from the Midwest, and I've lived a bunch of places, but I'm from the Midwest, and I've spent a lot of time like in Minnesota, Wisconsin, sometime in Michigan, Illinois, and I've hiked all over there. And what I've come to appreciate about California and the West more macroly, especially some of the time I spent in Oregon hiking, is just how different you have to treat the wild, right? Because this is real wild, right? Like, like maybe, in Southern Illinois, I heard there was a cougar on the loose that they were worried about, but I'm pretty sure they took care of that, as in like, culled that cougar pretty quickly.
Right.
Where like Yosemite, so like a lot of people that I've kind of connected with here in Southern California, they all have, not all, but a lot of them have these Yosemite family trips growing up. And like what I know about like the last 30 years of, the work there that's being done and kind of bringing back the wildlife is how special of a place that Yosemite Valley is, as a being like so close with nature, and it's, or the wild, and it's in a pretty untouched way, but you can still experience and see, fairly up close, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a different level of the leave no trace ethic, and there's also a different level of caution that you have to bring to things as you get farther and farther out, away from, we're sort of used to people being able to come and rescue you if you get into trouble. And,
right.
It's kind of amazing. I haven't done this with my kids, and when I think about it now as a parent, the amount of preparation work, and then just also comfort with the risk that it took my parents to be, back then they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have GPS, anything. You take a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old 3 days out from the trailhead, and if something goes wrong, you have to get back pretty quickly.
Right, right.
But it's all part of the adventure. It made it that much more exciting. And it snowed on us one time, and I got a fever, and they hiked out in the snow, and everything was fine. But it was like, for me, they were probably terrified, but for me, it was just this like, this is amazing.
Right, right. I could imagine that imprinting quite a strong memory, right? Like that sounds awesome. Like for me, like thinking about, I don't have kids, but thinking about having kids and being in that situation, that'd be nerve wracking. But and I don't know how I'd be able to like come down from that adrenaline rush. But as a kid, like thinking about me as a kid going in through that would just be so awe-inspiring.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and the kind of, I think the other thing is just, it has less to do with California or the wild, but just you go out in a place where there aren't any other people, and you get the undivided attention of your parents, so those experiences of watching the sunset from the high granite in Yosemite and being able to see out over the mountains, all of that is really special. But the thing that really, I think, made it magical to me was having my dad's arm around my shoulders,
Right.
as we were looking out. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great memories to have. Yeah, I when I have kids, I'm gonna very much look forward to doing a lot of things like that. But the one thing I wanted to go back to of kind of like leaving the high mountains and going down into the Central Valley and kind of the uh, color change, kind of from green to concrete. And one of the things I wanted to just touch upon is when you are in those more ecologically diverse or more natural environments, of like the abundance of them, right? And that is one of the things that I think that without truly experiencing or going to those places, you don't realize like how much there is wildlife, that potentiality everywhere, right? And Yosemite, I think, is the most interesting one of the more interesting places to me, because like I said, how versus like Glacier National Park in Montana, you can definitely see some really cool stuff there, but that's a hike to get to, that you're probably going to really hike to get in there, where Yosemite is far more accessible. And I was just wondering like what you've seen over the course of going there in Yosemite. Like, how have you seen that kind of nature grow, and how does that differ from other parks that you've been to or other experiences, especially like the work that you're doing? I'm imagine it touches upon a lot of like Yosemite I see as a case study in a lot of places of just saying like, look, like we could really, we can bring back predators, for example, I know is one of them, or there's other things we can do to kind of, we shouldn't always be hands off, right?
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of interesting work that's been done in Yosemite in particular, and they brought back fire there earlier on than many other places. Both in terms
I didn't exactly remember that. That's interesting.
Yeah, both in terms of introducing prescribed burns and allowing wildfires to burn. And so Yosemite itself is in much better shape in terms of the forest health. But in terms of the different experiences of nature that I've had in the different places I've visited, I think my journey as an environmentalist went from really being focused on the aesthetics, on this place that's the high mountains that's so beautiful, and getting to see, like you say, all these charismatic megafauna. Back when I was a kid, they really didn't have a good system for backpackers to deal with bears. Now they require everybody to bring these bear canisters, and the technology just hadn't been invented. The canisters they're like plastic canisters that bears can't break into.
Oh, you mean like to put your food in? I gotcha.
Yeah. But before, it was just you'd counterbalance 2 bags in a tree, and the bears were really good at getting those, and so there's all this waking up in the middle of the night to bang pots and pans and throw rocks at the bear, and so there's all of this flora and fauna that's just so beautiful that you can't help but notice it. But the kind of journey that I went on as an environmentalist was realizing how much awesome stuff there was, in our own backyards, in the parking lots of the strip malls, the crappy little weeds that are growing up between the cracks of the sidewalk, and coming to really appreciate and find wonder in those things as well. And so I've become less oriented around aesthetics and more interested in trying to figure out how do we keep those really special places, and like Yosemite, like Glacier National Park, how do we honor the places where we are and start to notice those and be able to live with nature in our daily lives? And then how do we make the whole thing work? How do we get to sustainability so that we're not just constantly expanding more and more into those last refuges, and allowing for some harmony in the places where we are living. So and my work now is really around that. Like, what the heck do we do to bring ourselves back into balance, and make room for probably 2 or 3 billion more people before we top out, and then give our great grandchildren a really good chance at having an awesome future.
That's great. Yeah. Now that we're in the Anthropocene, how can we actually have it be thriving, right?
Yeah.
That's great. It's interesting. Your journey in environmentalism is very similar to kind of the relationship with nature the U.S. government had kind of developed. They were at first really only into those national parks that were really big in grandeur, and for example, like coming from the Midwest, one of the things that honestly breaks my heart once I kind of woke up to the fact that monoculture and having whole states worth of land dedicated to that is really terrible. That there is no giant national park for prairie land, right?
Right.
I read these first accounts of settlers and and explorers, and they're talking about how it looked like an ocean and felt like an ocean. You know what I mean? And some of that charismatic megafauna, which is a great word, like the elks and all of that, were actually from the prairies and fled into the mountains, which I think is interesting. Also, what you were saying of kind of instead of just constantly infringing more and more and more on these special places. For example, the whole National Park Service was largely stirred from Teddy Roosevelt not wanting to have advertisement in the Grand Canyon. You know what I mean? So it's not like there hasn't always been a perennial want to capitalize on that. It's
Exactly.
Obviously it's all too easy to capitalize on spectacles like that, right? Like I would imagine a big bed and breakfast in the middle of the Yosemite Valley would be catch quite a good fitting, right?
Absolutely.
And then ultimately leading into kind of how do we all live within a garden in kind of some kind of manner or ways. I think that's really great.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything, I guess, kind of what's some of the ways that, like the novel ways that you've really seen a lot of hope or a lot of faith in that kind of application?
The application being
I guess framework of like how do we live more in like these concrete strip malls,
Right.
and I'm assuming take more advantage of what was indigenous or native to that area, right?
It's some of that. It's also celebrating the mixing and the immigration of different species. One thing my second book is about urban wildlife, and one of the things I found as I was writing that is that there was much greater diversity of wildlife in the cities than where I grew up in the foothills of the Sierra. So when I was a boy in Nevada City, California, there were 4 or 5 main trees. Ponderosa pine, black oak, live oak, some incense cedar and madrones. But that's you got those, and you're pretty well set. You know your trees, and there's a couple others, but those are the main ones. And in San Francisco, when I started paying attention, I was kind of bowled over by the number of trees, because you realize you're in this Mediterranean climate. You've got the native trees, but you also have the trees from the same climate in Tasmania and Australia that people have brought in. Right. You have the same trees from the Mediterranean. So there's this mixture of the entire world coming together, just like the immigrants who came to San Francisco and brought these trees. And then you have all these, the parasites of those things, and you have.
So you were saying so it's not just promoting the indigenous species, but also kind of accepting, accepting what's been happening, and kind of, I'm going to say it again, like the Anthropocene, right? Like that we're in this new age of scientific epoch, and that epoch is one that is defined by Homo sapiens running and controlling pretty much every major parcel of land, or at least influencing it, land or ocean, to be honest, of the entire marble that we're on, right? And what you're saying is kind of an acceptance of that. And what I would also toss in there as a question is part of your kind of framework of saying, like, well, let's accept the fact that there are, you know, plants that are brought over here that are species or what have you that are actually thriving within the ecosystem. Is part of that also kind of an inevitability, or at least, how can I put this? What are your thoughts on that kind of being almost a requirement due to the fact of how much the ecological collapse is accelerating and kind of the reshaping of the hemispheric zones and ecological zones they're in, right? I mean, like,
Yep.
species that used to survive at 7,000 feet at altitude are now needing 9,000 and drought conditions and go on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so I think we are going to. It's not so much a question of are we going to need to. I mean, I've gotten more and more deeply pragmatic as I've watched this crisis unfold, and it's just hard. It's hard to be an idealist and be an environmentalist, and just because the things that you have ideals for just are constantly under attack, and the ideals, you know, the sort of very romantic and aesthetic ideals that I had as a kid, just prove over and over again to be like twigs before the flood of humanity and commerce, just, you know, coming through and changing everything. And so it's less to do with, you know, we should accept non-native species and celebrate them, and more to do with, like, let's just figure out what works. You know, there's some things we definitely will decide, you know, we don't want to have this species over here. This is really causing trouble, and other things are going to work. And so for me, it's less about, like, I care less if a species is native or not. I care more about how it can benefit us. You know, can we take some measure of, can we use it for fuel or fiber or food? Can we create interesting habitat with it? Is it beautiful? How is it going to affect the rest of the ecosystem? Those are the types of things that I care about more than the native or non-native parts of it. And it's just like, you know, we're in such trouble. I feel like everything else sort of has to go out the window in order to just take care of fixing those things that we need to fix.
Yeah, I liked what you said there. Kind of, where does this species, you know, flora or fauna, fit into the continuum of the ecosystem? Does it fit well, and is it of service in some way to the ecosystem? And I say ecosystem because I'm including Homo sapiens in there.
Nice.
I know we talked about,
I like that,
marketplace earlier and before, but one of the things that I like a lot in their framing of climate change is their ongoing series of it. They don't call it climate change; they call it how do we survive, or how will we survive, right? And I think that's interesting because, I mean, you know, something I do think about a lot about is mass migrations, right? Like, mass migrations of Homo sapiens is something that has been a characteristic of pretty much every single major historical shift ever. And we're starting to see it now. And kind of, that's what you're saying, is how can we kind of live within everything to thrive, right?
Exactly. That's it.
So what's some of the, well, I mean, okay, so I first got kind of tipped off to you from a Twitter thread, actually, where you were talking about some of the wildfires out here. And I had spoken with Ron Good. He's a tribal leader of the North Fork Mono tribe, about mostly about his culture in general. But one of the things that I think is so diluted nowadays is any sense of pragmatism, which is interesting. It's interesting to hear that I mean, I would say it's a safe assumption that most people think that environmentalists are idealists. But to hear you say start off with being a pragmatist, I think is also something that is uh, funny given our time and nuance loss and pragmatism out the door. But in which the Twitter thread that you were kind of mentioned in was saying how some of the fires, and I won't even just say specified this year. I would even say, like, you can talk about Paradise. Paradise was definitely a result of the campfire, definitely a result of forest management issues as well as power line management issues. I recently went on to another investigative thread about how that was started from a 90+ year old bolt that failed. The reason the plus is in front of 90 is because PG&E doesn't keep any records of anything. So that's great. But and what I was talking about with Ron as well was generally how, and this, I find this personally pretty funny because I have this philosophy that the truth only exists in parallel, right? It's never one thing. It's always multiple things at once. And if you ever try to lay it out, and it's not, you can't tangible, you can't grab it. It's got to be multiple things. And most of the time they exist in conflict with each other, which is perplexing. But that you have the response on one side, I don't even call a name to it, saying this is climate change, and the response on the other side is saying that this is forest mismanagement. And I think that the truth is that it's both of those things and more, right? And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that. Like, how much of this is result of the Anthropocene and just humans taking over everything? How much is the result of, the effects of greenhouse gases and the complete shifting of weather patterns, and then also just management of the land?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's tons of different things that you can pin as the culprits for these major fires. But if you want to kind of generalize, the two prime movers are those things that you just said. We're heating up the earth, and that's making the weather in California certainly hotter, and heat dries things out. So you have you don't have as much snowpack filtering down throughout the summer and feeding those tree roots and keeping those streams alive, and that means that you have more trees dying when there's droughts or trees that are just under stress. And when trees are under stress, they become vulnerable to infestation. And there's all these beetles that have come and just girdled in some places, 90% of the pines. And so these forests turn from green to red and then eventually to gray if they have enough time. But often, as we're seeing this year, those dry red trees just turn into tinder for the fires. So there's definitely an element of climate change here. Now, at the same time, we've been radically changing the way that this ecosystem works by suppressing fires and from getting away from the native landscape management of actually setting fires. There's the Karuk in Northern California, up around the Klamath, talk about how the salmon need enough smoke in the air so that it cools, keeps the sun from heating up the water too much. And it's true, the water needs to be cool enough or else the fish die. But it also is true that with enough fires, then that means there's fewer, more widely spaced trees. That in each one of those trees is a straw in the ground that's sucking water out of it. So fewer, more widely spaced trees means more moisture to go around. It means healthier forests. It means more water in the rivers. It also means that the bark beetles have a harder time getting from tree to tree. There's some that don't move very well. If you have trees more widely spaced, then just every couple of feet, some of these beetles spread much, much more slowly. It really makes a difference. So, so if we hadn't had climate change at all, we would have sort of stumbled through longer. There would have been we'd be able to push off the tipping point for maybe decades. But you could also turn it around the other way and say, well, if we still had climate change, but we'd managed the forest really well, there just wouldn't be the fuels there. We wouldn't have the density of trees. We wouldn't have this huge number of dead trees. We wouldn't have, in some places, it's not so much the trees, it's a real density of brush. In Nevada City where I live, and the same is true around Paradise, there's places where it's more of this mixed chaparral forest where you have just these intense manzanita groves. Manzanita are beautiful plants, but when they grow for 40 years or something, they turn really big and they can just explode. They have all these oils in them, and they just explode when the fires hit.
Wow.
And they drop these, they're little round leaves that don't decompose very well, and it just becomes this pile of duff like this that is great for starting fires. So that was a big issue around Paradise. And so, certainly it's impossible to disentangle. And I think you see people on both sides really trying to make hay over, like, I can frame this as, look, there's no climate change here, or I can frame this as, look, the entire, let's see, what, I have it backwards now. Look, there's no climate change here, or look, it's all climate change. We don't need to touch our forests. They're natural and beautiful, and so the pragmatist, the solution is, gosh, we got to do it all. Right. We got to use these forests. We've got to realize that there's a trade-off between the aesthetics of having these things just be beautiful, and also understanding that the foothills and Sierras of California are one of the best places in the world to grow timber really quickly. And if you like wood things,
right.
like many of my my wife teases me because whenever we're making design decisions, I always want like unfinished wood. It's just I think it's so beautiful, and that really comes from my sort of hippie, all natural upbringing, I think. And yet we were the ones that were out there trying to stop people from ever cutting down the trees to create that wood. So there's we have the chance to utilize this really productive area to have some timber and have it be, instead of just being purely motivated by profit, motivated by sustainability, so that a little bit is taken off at a time, so that the streams downstream are kept healthy, but it relieves pressure on the less law-abiding places in the world where most of our timber comes from now, from Russia and Southeast Asia, that are just, people are just coming in and being purely motivated by profit.
I didn't know that. So most of our timber, and when it comes to, like, I'm imagining like small goods making, is from
well, I don't know if I should say most. It's it's been a while since I've looked at the figures. I think in California we get a lot of our softwoods from Canada, which does a good job. And then there's like the big timber plantations in the southeastern U.S. But there's a ton of pulp and paper and some softwood timber production that comes from Russia, where it's just sort of robber barons, right. The oligarchs just sort of logging like crazy, and there's same thing in Southeast Asia. There's like the Indonesian cronies of the government who get handed a concession and just turn it into paper, or turn it into they log it off and then turn it into palm oil plantations. There's a lot of really beautiful tropical hardwoods that come out of the rainforest in Southeast Asia. So, by having some, we're in a position to really do it well here, and if we can produce some timber here while also having the side benefit of managing our fire risk, and do it well and be sustainable, that really does take pressure off of the world market.
Totally. Yeah, and I mean, not only from like the local and kind of more macro carbon sinks of ripping out a whole forest or valley or section of land, shipping it and processing it and all of that is probably going to be done with less regulation than it would be done here in the States. And even just shipping it alone is quite stark as far as like the carbon cost and kind of just greater insustainability of it. One of the things that Ron mentioned to me when I was talking with him was pre-1815, how most of the forests in California had about 40% were canopy, and now it's like 80 to 90%. So that just kind of gives perspective to how much the overgrowth really is. So I want to be conscious of time, but could you go a little bit into kind of like the history of logging and kind of what you were mentioning there, and what happened to that kind of get us to the point now, and kind of where you were kind of hinting at it along the edges there of potentially going back to logging in some capacity, but kind of run through that a little bit?
Yeah. I'll try and just give you like the super Cliff Notes version. And my knowledge is really fairly limited to California because that's what I'm most interested in. But this comes from growing up in a town that really was an extractive industries town. Nevada City, California was founded during the gold rush. It was one of the boom towns built on gold. And then when the gold ran out, it kind of crashed, and people looked around and saw timber, and that was kind of the next thing. During the gold rush, they basically cut down all of the trees for beams to support the mines, they built these amazing flumes to take water from high up on a river and then move it down. And so you have this pressure to create a giant stream of water to blast away the hillside and filter out the gold. And those just went for miles and miles and miles and took a lot of timber. So if you look at the pictures of Nevada City post gold rush, and it's just desolate. There's no trees, and everything in town was a muddy mess. And so then in California, the kind of all of the trees grew back at the same time. So you had this everything, instead of being a staggered forest of different ages and heights, you had everything growing back at once. And then being clear cut as soon as it was ready, and that kind of continued more or less. You see these. It depended on the price of timber, and there were some years where there wasn't as much logging, some years where it was more. But there's graphs of timber production from Forest Service land. And it kind of just, kept creeping up as they learned more ways of extracting more timber and growing trees quickly. And but the general idea was, this is the one purpose. We're going to just get as much wood from this land as possible, and we're really not going to worry about what happens downstream or to other species that depend on the forest, or or really recreation at all, or people that want a beautiful place to be. And then in the when I come into the scene, I was born in 1978, and so that's sort of well into the environmental movement. And so my parents were these Berkeley hippies who moved up to this little town to get back to the land and shelter their child from the evils of modern technology. I was learning to walk, and I was falling on the concrete sidewalk and skinning my knees, and my dad was like, this is not acceptable. We need to go somewhere softer. We need to get back to the garden.
That's great.
So we move up to this town that's sort of one of the last remaining industries there is timber, and try and stop it. Me and my mom went and tagged trees, put signs around trees that were certain diameter in a proposed shopping center to see if we could stop that from being cut down. And we failed. It became a shopping center. But the work was really being done by the spotted owl and the court cases. This was really this test case for the Endangered Species Act, and it found that really you could just say, stop. This entire industry needs to stop in order to protect this one animal. And in California, it really, at least on public land, it stopped logging completely. And there's still some big private timber production, but they have to be a lot more careful about how they do things. And so that was end of the 70s into the late 80s. And then for the next 30 years, really, we, the environmentalists, we had won this fight, and we really had a chance to own the problems that came with it. Like, we couldn't blame everything anymore on the clear cutters and the timber companies. And we started to see that things were, that it was a heck of a lot of work to maintain defensible space around our houses every year. And that even if we did our best, we were fighting this losing battle, that the forests were going to burn sooner or later, and things were getting worse year after year. And so there's been this just fascinating evolution where these deep green environmentalists and gray-haired hippies are saying, gosh, we need some form of sustainable timber production. There's it's going to be ugly. A tree stump is not as beautiful as a full-grown sugar pine, but it makes sense we want that wood, and we want to keep our forests healthy, and so there's some. I think there's a spectrum. The sort of more romantic environmentalists will say, like, yes, we need more fire, but let's not actually touch it, and God forbid we introduce commerce into it and maybe sell some of this or use it for our own gain. And on the more pragmatic end, you have people like me who are saying, look, let's do the best we can, and it's awfully hypocritical to be saying, don't touch the trees in my backyard for timber when you're also buying wood for your houses and for your toilet paper and what have you.
Right. Wow, that was a really great overview. Thank you for that. It's really interesting how many unintended consequences come from even the good things, right?
Right.
That's great.
Always.
Yeah. So where is that at right now? Like, is that, I would imagine, let me preface it with this, by right now that COVID and the fact that there is giant fires burning, probably a lot of this is more contentious or paused at the same time than it probably was not given big fires to fight and the fact that there's a pandemic going on. But kind of is the thoughts evolving more into action? Have you seen that in the past few years?
Yeah, absolutely. There's in terms of
Culling the forest,
changing the way forests are managed.
Yeah, culling the forest, or I'm gonna start with culling the forest because I mean trees obviously have a big part of this. So like the San Juan National Forest in Colorado, I spent some time there and I was really shocked at some of the valleys that are there. Or that the full valley is filled with dead trees, and that is from beetles that are native, but because of the drought they are having, the forest is thinning itself out because it's getting less and less water, and then that makes it more susceptible to the native beetles. The native beetles can keep jumping, and it's this exact same scenario of what we're talking about here. So in both kind of...
They're just ahead of us from a little, they're the farther south you go, you start to see climate change. This is the wave that's coming north.
Yes, that's very true. Yeah, the kind of as the heat is pushing everything further and further up, right? The other thing, too, is that they actually do have a logging industry in the San Juan, but the big problem is that they're not having enough people buy it from the market, actually. So it's not sustaining itself as well as it probably could be if it was shifted a little bit. But so both kind of, where are you kind of seeing the ideas shift turn into action in both the logging end of it, particularly, and then also kind of the idea of being a more active participant in the nature and kind of helping it along to thrive?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly the battle days of the timber wars. It really seems like that's over. It really seems like there's a few polarized people at the fringes, but these days there's a lot of people who are on the same page, and so you have quite a bit of agreement about the need to reintroduce fire into these. I mean, that point, I think there's really no disagreement. Everybody really agrees that we need more fire on the landscape.
That's really, I would think for most people hearing that's pretty surprising, given kind of...
Yeah, I think that, and I think that part of what's happened is that, you have these rural issues about land management that are hard for people. It's very easy to be romantic about the land when you live far away from it, right? But when the smoke is in your city for weeks on end every year, you start to become very pragmatic very quickly, and you start to say, okay, what can we actually do?
Right.
And so the idea that we're going to burn the forest sounds horrible from a romantic perspective, but people can really figure it out quickly when they're motivated by their self-interest, and they're like, is California going to be this smoky hellscape 2 or 3 weeks out of every year for the next century, or what are we talking about here? And so it's not that hard to grok this idea that you could have prescribed burns through the winter and spring and space out this smoke, and there'd be, because it's such a lower temperature, there'd be a lot less smoke. People really get that. And I think people also get the idea that there's places where the forest is so dense that it makes sense to do some thinning, or to come in with these masticating machines that can cut up the smaller trees and manzanita. And so we really are seeing progress. There's places where I was just on the phone with a representative from the California Department of Natural Resources trying to hear what California was doing. And they just made a deal with the Forest Service to, they say, treat, which means prescribed burns, logging, mastication, thinning. they're going to treat 1 million acres a year in conjunction with the Forest Service. And to give you a sense, California has about 33 million acres of forest, and there's some 15 that they've identified as really needing treatment. So it's like close to cities. You can actually get to it. It's hasn't been burned in a long time. So if you treat 1 million acres a year, that takes that footprint down in 15 years. 15 years is about the time that it needs to grow back. So you'd never be able to stop, right?
Right, continuum again, right?
Yeah, exactly. But that's kind of the level that would work. And then you'd have these deeper in the wilderness things that just out of control wildfires would manage, basically. So that's happening. That is an agreement that was made. And then you see these projects, like there's this little town of Colfax that's near Nevada City, where I grew up. And this representative from California Department of Natural Resources was describing this project there, because I was describing, like, have these fights over whether we can manage the forest actually really ended, or is this just happy talk? And so she told me about this project where they wanted to build this fire break around Colfax, keep fire from sweeping into town. And Governor Gavin Newsom suspended the Environmental Quality Act in order to just be able to do it quickly without review. And normally this is just like catnip for environmentalists. You'd have people sue this and
right.
and stop it. But it was a project that was done with these environmental nonprofits on board who are working hand in hand with the state. And things have just gotten so crazy bad that everybody kind of agrees that this is a problem. And so you had, I think it was the Native Plant Society working with the state, and they came in and they cut out a bunch of manzanita and overgrown blackberries, and the Native Plant Society did a lot of advising on what could go back. And a year after they said we should do this, you had this area that was filling up with wildflowers, and butterflies were flitting from stem to stem, and it was this beautiful area, and it was this natural fire break as well. So these things, it's actually happening. The other thing that gives me some hope is just on the very sort of commercial side is I wrote a story about how environmentalists in Nevada City have come around to supporting a biomass plant in town, which is like, just anathema. The Sierra Club calls biomass worse than coal, because, you're basically burning trees to create energy, and trees don't have the same energy density as coal, so you need to burn more to get the same amount. It creates pollution.
Right. It's different particulates too, right? Isn't that part of it?
Yeah, you get different particulates. The particulates from coal are pretty nasty as well.
Yeah.
But with the
not as much
with
volume,
the environmentalists,
right? That was what I was more getting at.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. What the environmentalists in town had gotten at was that these forests were going to burn one way or another. That they were either going to cut this underbrush down and put it into burn piles, or a giant fire was going to come through and make way worse smoke pollution, or they could burn it very efficiently in a gas retort burner and have much less pollution, and, by the way, generate some electricity that could displace fossil fuels. And so this is sort of mind-blowing that you have these super greens saying, like, let's build an industry to burn trees and create an entire network of chainsaws and trucks to feed it and all of this stuff. And so the fact that people have come around to that that kind of pragmatism really gives me hope. I don't know if that'll actually get built. It's not on pause so much because of COVID, but more because of the electrical company's bankruptcy and all the complications with that.
Well, hopefully they wouldn't be running this anyways. But that's really interesting.
Well, they're key to because it's a monopoly. PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, they sort of it's a sort of stupidly complicated bureaucratic system where it only works financially if it's subsidized, and it's subsidized through forcing PG&E to pay far above market rates for this. So you could do it much more simply. You could just say, like, this is a smart thing to do to keep our forests healthy and to create some clean power, and let's subsidize it directly. But instead they twist the utilities arm to take that hit instead.
Of course. But I mean, all of those things kind of packaged up together, it builds a lot of faith in the future for myself. And kind of the thought that it kind of sparks is the action that happens when you're kind of waiting on the barbarians versus when the barbarians are at your gates, right? And kind of a lot of what we've had before, and maybe perhaps even, I'll even extend it this far, maybe some of the idealism on both sides of, come on, this isn't a problem, to like the best thing we could do is nothing, as far as like, let's hands off this area, and now kind of both of those are forced to really kind of say, like, there's something coming to get us and we need to figure this out now.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
That's great.
It's a good metaphor.
Cotes, there's a great book, Waiting on the Barbarians.
Yeah,
it's great. It's a great novel. It's very short, and also like his writing is stupendous. Like the opening scene of it is fantastic.
I've never read him. I've seen his books around, but that's a good reminder. I should pick that up.
It's the only one of his that I've read, and it's based off a poem. And I read the poem after I read the book, and I'm glad I did it in that order. And because I kind of suspected how the book was going to end, but it's still how it came about surprised me, and I think it's in a great example of how civilizations, how peak civilizations fall. It's an interesting case study.
Cool.
But
that sounds awesome.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoy it. I think about that book a lot. But anything else? I know I want to be conscious of your time. Thank you so much for taking your time and talking with me. I wanted to mostly talk about the logging and things we were riffing on before, so I appreciate that. Is there anything else that while I still had you?
No, I think I feel like we've hit the important. I feel like we pretty much have solved all of the problems of humanity. So
yeah, it only took us less than 60 minutes.
If everybody would just listen to this podcast, we'd be set. We could just relax.
There we go. We'll be set.